Well, as JJ said, we're coming to the conclusion of Ruth. Ruth is a story that it really is all about the hesed of God. That's the word that the Jews would use, the loving kindness of God toward his people, and how that plays out in our real world. You know, a couple of weeks ago, Alice and I celebrated an anniversary of our marriage. Kids, how many years do you think we've been married? No one's even willing to take a shot. 41 years we've been there. 41 years. And you know, at least for me, an anniversary comes along and I remember things. You know, I remember what it was and what we've been through. I remember how beautiful she was on the day of our marriage. I remember when the kids were born. I remember great days and hard days. But I found myself also remembering this time around how blessed I felt when Alice agreed to become my wife. I remember how much taller I walked that day when Alice declared her love and her devotion to me. I was happier, I was more confident. I felt blessed by the hesed, the loving kindness of not only Alice Hook, who would become Alice Hook Warner, but by God himself. I felt as though he had sent her into my life. Well, I tell that story not just to get on Alice's good side, but I hope it works. But I tell it because that's the story that we have in Ruth. That's the story. God has worked through the everyday lives of people, and through their love brings healing and wondrous gifts to not only this tiny group of people, but as we'll see, to many more through that. The story is that through the love that develops between Boaz and Ruth, Boaz feels blessed. Naomi, who felt as though she had nothing left, is restored. Ruth picks up a new life, all through the hesed, the loving kindness of our God. Last week we heard Pastor Jan tell the story of how Ruth has offered to Boaz to become his wife. And Boaz says, well, I'm all about that, but the practice was in that time for a young widow to be taken as wife by the next of kin. This was a way of caring for that widow and carrying on the name of her former husband. So he says, I am close in terms of next of kin, but there is one who has a right of first refusal before me. And so I got to deal with him. So the very next day, he goes to the gate of the city where all of the legal questions were dealt with in the day. And he arranges to meet with this other next of kin. And he says to him, you know, Naomi has this piece of property that actually has belonged to her husband and then her sons. They're all dead. You have the right to buy this very attractive piece of property for a good price. Would you like to do that? And the next of kin, not being a fool, says, yeah, I would. And he says, fine. And go and when you buy that piece of property, you will also get Ruth the Moabite, this foreigner, as your wife. All of a sudden, the next of kin remembers he's got a prior engagement. See, he doesn't want to diminish his estate by bringing in this woman he doesn't know. And he says, no, I'm going to then refuse. So he walks away. Boaz turns to the people who basically act as judge and says, you know, man, I'm the next one in line. I am going to redeem the property. I'll pay for the property, and I will take Ruth as my wife. The people bless this. All righteousness has been dealt with, and they become married, Ruth and Boaz. And Ruth conceives and bears a son. And we begin to see the story dramatically turn. At the beginning of the story of Ruth, in the first chapter, all of this takes place because there was great famine in Israel. Well, last week we heard the famine was gone, but there was this great incoming of grain. Now there's a plentiful harvest. Where there was barrenness to begin with, Ruth did not have a child with Mahlon. But now, in this new marriage, she delivers a son. The women of the village, they interpret this blessing for Naomi. They say of this new son, born of Ruth and Boaz, they say, he shall be to you a restorer of life and nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him to you. Ruth is Naomi's greatest blessing. See, abundant harvest, overflowing blessings, new life where there was only emptiness. All of it is made possible through the hesed, the kindness of our God. And actually, through Ruth and Boaz, everyday, ordinary people who demonstrate the extraordinary love and faithfulness and devotion of God for his people. For one last note, the story, the book of Ruth ends with this genealogy. It's difficult to read. And we learn there that this child, born to Ruth and Boaz, this child will be named Obed. Obed will be the grandfather of David, Israel's most beloved king. See, here's where the story of Ruth leaves us, with the promise of God's faithful love, God's hesed, overflowing, not just with these ordinary folks, not just with these 2 widows and the farmer, but through David they reach out to, those blessings reach out to the entire family of Israel. And then, through David's greater son, Jesus, they reach all the way down. Those blessings reach all the way down to you and to me. Thanks be to God. We have blessing upon blessing, heaped up, overflowing, up on over. Thanks be to God for what he has done. Naomi is restored. If you remember back at the beginning of the story, it starts with Naomi's husband died, then her 2 sons are dead, and she feels utterly lost. She cannot see any future for herself. When she returns to Bethlehem, and the women who have known her greet her, they call for her, Naomi, Naomi. And she says, don't call me Naomi anymore. No, I am not Naomi. I am Mara, bitter, for God has turned his back on her. But here at the end of the story, she is Naomi once more. She has been restored. She has a new life. She has been blessed beyond what she could imagine. All because of the undeserved love of God and his devotion to his people. We would call that grace. Call that grace. If you look this week, if you look around yourself, you will see the activity of God all around you. It takes place all around us. It's often disguised through the actions of everyday people. Sometimes even in our own actions, it comes forth. You know, when I was a young pastor, I began taking groups of our young people to confirmation camp. Did that for about 26 years. It was in 1979 I went for the first time. It was supposedly, as the story was told to me, that was the first confirmation camp in the Lutheran Church. I was working with a bunch of pastors who were about 17 years my elder. I learned so much from those guys. And I remember the first year, the first class that I had, there was a young fellow who was not in my congregation in the class. His name was Billy Fredericks. And Billy was very shy. He was a farmer's son, and he was especially shy around the girls, and had trouble speaking up at first, but as the week went on, and we would walk together around the camp, he would begin to tell his story. And he told me about things he had done in 4-H. That was important to him. And I remember asking him a question. I don't even remember what the question was now, but it was something about how you do something on the farm. And he explained it to me in great detail. And I had no idea how it was done. And I found it interesting. And when it came to Friday night in the final service of the week, I was preaching. I was preaching on the basis of the theology of the new guy. It's well known among pastors. The new guy always preaches because, you got to break them in, right? Even if you don't know what you're doing, you preach. Okay? So I was preaching that night. And a point I was trying to make went together with his story. And I told a little bit of his story. And thanked him for it. And I didn't think much about it until I saw him afterwards, and I noticed he just walked a little bit taller. He seemed a little bit more confident. Because that story had been heard and shared, he felt a little bit better about himself, I think. I see that happening again and again. I see it happening on Tuesdays among the men when they share their stories back and forth and they're valued. And as they're valued, those guys feel like, my life counts for something. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. I don't learn very quickly, but I do learn. And by the next year, when I got there to camp, I had begun to realize that admiring someone else is an important thing, and it helps people to grow. And that next year, the second year, I began a practice that lasted for the next 25 years. For me, the last day of class, I would take each young person aside for a few minutes and talk to them about what I had seen, what I admired in them, how what they had done had affected me, and how I see a future for that in their lives. And I noticed a couple of years later, when the camp changed directors, that practice was instituted among all of the counselors. They did that each Friday night after our worship service. They called that affirmations. Maybe that's a common practice today. But I noticed that it seemed to help a little bit. It seemed to make a little difference. And then as I got a bit older and thought about this a little more, I began to think the congregation should have opportunities to do that for those young people. And it became our practice for confirmation that the young people, they led worship on their confirmation day. They would lead all the music. Some of them would play instruments. They would pray. And then the students would choose from among themselves a preacher every year. And they preached. And all of those students, they were so nervous beforehand. And afterwards, they stood more erectly. They were 2 inches taller, They had been affirmed by the congregation. They felt good about themselves. 5 of those young people through the years went on to become ordained ordained into the Lutheran Church as pastor. Was it because of that effort? I wouldn't bet on that. But I bet you they all would say they remembered that and that it was important at the time. And that they'd been touched by it. Maybe we planted them with Steve. But they went on to become pastors in the church. And now we're out affirming others. The activity of God is all around us. Sometimes we're a part of that activity. Last week, at the end of the sermon, during the second service, the hymn that we sang was "As the Grains of Wheat." It's in your blue hymn, 705. I'm going to look it up. But the line that hit me in that was, "As this cup of blessing is shared within our midst, may we share that presence of your love." In just a moment, we'll come to the table of grace and communion, and we will receive that gift of God's love, that cup of blessing. And at that moment, Christ will come to be with each of us and affirm us by forgiving our sin. He will affirm us by wrapping his arms around us and encouraging and strengthening our faith. He will affirm us so that we can go forward and affirm others.